Was Trials of Osiris this past weekend a success? Guys, we had a number of people come by the stream the other day asking questions about the matchmaking changes. And I feel like a lot of people are assuming that the changes that we saw this past weekend are simply a temporary one. Guys, that is not the case. What we experienced this past weekend is what we're going to be getting at all times next season. Bungie actually stated this in their Crucible blog posts, as well as the TWAB a few weeks ago, that Trials Labs would be conducted on week 8, which was this one this past weekend, and week 11 of season 20. And the goal of this was for Bungie to test the new matchmaking parameters to gather analytics and verify that they work as intended on a large scale. Now, what this entails, guys, is the challenger pool and the practice pool. And this is what you experienced this past weekend. These are essentially two soft pools, meaning it can be blended, but the game will try not to do so. Quote, the distinction is not as dramatic as the one between flawless and non-flawless that's in the current system. But the challenger pool is where most players who currently play Trials on a week-to-week basis and want to go flawless will play. It represents an experience more like the original iteration of Trials of D1 without the focus on making games more difficult as the Trials card progresses or after you've been flawless. Now, the main takeaway for this is that this pool matches solely on connection. This is not ticket-based matchmaking. Now, what this means, guys, is you could go through an entire card matching people with only 1 or maybe 2 wins on their card. At the same time, you could play the exact same card again and match folks on their final game going flawless every single game. It's purely RNG. Now, players who have any card with no losses, including a card after reset, or those playing with someone in their fire team that has a card with no losses, will be placed in this challenger pool. Now, the other pool is the practice pool. Now, this pool is targeted at newer, less experienced players. And quotes, players who are not yet ready to give going flawless a shot. Now, this pool matches based on connection and weekly performance. Essentially, how well you've done in Trials that week, and it resets every single week. Now, only players with a flawed card or those on their first game of the week can play in this pool. Everyone in your fire team must have a flawed card or be on the first game of the week. Now, there's protections for this. You have stomp protection, farming protection, but the main takeaway here, guys, and this is the big one. A lot of people assume, at least people coming by our chat, assume that this was just something Bungie wanted to try out for Crucible Labs. That is not the case, guys. Pull directly from that Crucible blog post. As always, we will be playing alongside you all in both pools and monitoring feedback on the new matchmaking system as the season progresses, with the intent to push it live full time in season 21. Guys, there it is. Essentially, what you experienced this past weekend is what you're going to be experiencing full time next season. Now, with that being said, before you're like, oh my God, that's terrible, this was the sweatiest weekend of Trials, and we're going to get into the stats in just a moment. Keep in mind that Bungie is updating the Mercy passage. Starting next season, it will forgive 2 losses if you had not been flawless for the week, and reverts to its old behavior of forgiving a single loss once you go flawless. Now, with all of that being said, what this really means is the current system that we have in the game, this is the last season for it. Primarily, flawless pool. You see, every single Sunday, guys, at reset, a hard flawless pool is implemented into the game. Meaning, if you have gone flawless for that weekend, you are only going to be playing against players that have gone flawless. And if you have not gone flawless for that weekend, you're going to be playing against other non-flawless players. Bungie is essentially doing away with that system in order to keep us all in the same playing pool. They've also done away with the freelance playlist, moving to fire team based matchmaking, and listed in their goals here, this is to allow players to play with friends without worrying about whether they've gone flawless, and remove the motivation to reset cards in order to farm or carry. But the final note here is to better protect players who are struggling to find success in the playlist. Oh boy, this is where I get to ask you, did you find success this past weekend? Now, I'm going to give you 2 different points of data subjectively before we get into the hard numbers. First, this was the easiest weekend of Trials I've ever played when running carries. And believe me, I would have been doing carries all weekend long if I hadn't gotten sick. But even running carries on Sunday afternoon with 102-degree fever, these were still some of the freest games ever. With that being said, though, I also got to play solo. And I don't know what happened, but it was a night and day difference. And by night and day difference, I mean it went from being the easiest experience to straight ass. I'm talking ball sweat all over me constantly. It felt like the competitive playlist. But the difference here, at least in the competitive playlist, you would get some blueberries that had some sense. Playing solo in Trials, dude, I felt like I was playing with folks that have never played PvP in their life. And look, nothing against them. I like open matchmaking. Everybody needs to dip their toe. But dude, I played with a team that either A, intentionally didn't get the res, or just B, didn't know how. It was infuriating. All I can tell you is that when playing with a team, a full team, or even duos, the games were better. They really were. But then the moment I moved into solo, my God, things got rough. And this is kind of tough because we're coming off of the removal of freelance. And at some point, Bungie had to make a decision. Who do we screw here? Do we screw the solo player or do we screw the fire team? And I think Bungie took the route of screwing the solo player. Now, the good thing is, before my solo players all start to riot, is, well, you can get a fire team. And remember, at the end of the day, Bungie said the end game is friendship, and nothing inspires more friendship than Trials of Osiris. By the way, big shout out to our Discord if you're looking for a fire team. With that being said, when looking at the hard numbers, I want us to look at the ratio of flawless players, or players that went flawless, in comparison to the amount of people that played in the playlist. Now, understand I'm pulling all my numbers here from Trials reports, but let's actually go through a few of these. First up, back in February, we had Endless Veil. We had a whopping 245,000 players playing that weekend, with 52,000 players that went flawless. Now, essentially, the ratio here is that 21% of players went flawless for that weekend. Then we turn around to Burnout. We had 554,000 players that played on the weekend of March 31st through April the 4th, with 151,488 that went flawless. Approximately 27% of players went flawless for that weekend. So a good uptick here, guys. I mean, 21% to 27%. That's nice. Then we had Endless Veil again, April the 14th through April the 18th, with 409,594 players participating and 111,367 players going flawless. Now, this takes us to Distant Shore, which is this past weekend, but most notably this past weekend with the matchmaking changes. Now, this is a snapshot here, guys. Understand, these numbers have already changed since the recording of this video, but based on this snapshot that we had yesterday, 355,433 players had participated, with 66,978 that went flawless. Now, that number is concerning. The reason why that number is concerning is now we're dipping below 20%. You see, everything else that we just mentioned, even the players playing in February, the final week of Trials, you still had a 21% success rate amongst players playing in the Trials playlist. But with this rate, we're looking at 18.8%. Now, keep in mind, I'm looking at the numbers as it updates, and that number seems to be ticking up a little bit more, going from 18.8% to around 19.5%. So it's getting very close, right? And by the way, we're really narrowing down on flawless players, not flawless characters, as to not count repeats. With that being said, though, going from 27% down below 20% is definitely reflective of the flawless pool being removed. Keep in mind, nothing I'm saying here in this is going to change anything. Bungie is definitely making these matchmaking changes for the long haul. We're simply looking at the data, and all I'm saying from the data is, based on the flawless pool being removed this past weekend, flawless numbers did drop, and that's kind of a no-brainer. That's to be expected. Now, the other question is, will having 2 games forgiven with the new Mercy Passage update next season bring these numbers back up? Perhaps, and at least I would hope so. But there's a lot of factors that really go into a success of a Trials weekend. For instance, Javelin, which is a very popular map, and of course we had Immortal dropping the weekend of March 17th through March 21st. We had a 35% success rate. However, you take something like Midtown, which is not a very popular map, it had a 20.9% success rate for the week of February the 24th through February the 28th. So even though we can look at the data and say, all right, flawless pool being removed, these changes, we have less players going flawless, it must be shite. That doesn't say the whole story, because the time of the season and of course the map that's in rotation does play a role, most definitely. And also the reward for that weekend, because if it's a very coveted reward, all of a sudden there's lots of success rates inside of Trials. Players are playing harder. There's definitely an increase in recoveries, which I'm not going to get into right now. But regardless, there is a lot of factors here. I think the one constant I wanted to look at was, what was the success rate the last time Distant Shore was our map? Based on our analytics from July 22nd, 2022 to July 26th, we had a 24% success rate for Distant Shore. Now, keep in mind, Distant Shore is also a map that a lot of people don't like for Trials. Granted, I think for zone control, I'm okay with it. But that gives you an idea of the difference here in our success rates. Overall, I felt like my experience this past weekend was really good when playing with the fire team. But the moment I dipped off into solo territory, things got rough. And I mean way rough. To the point that I don't think I'm ever going to play Trials solo ever again. And I highly advise, if you are a solo player, to consider getting at least one person to play Trials with. Like, just having one other person playing on a duo team makes a huge difference. But what you experienced this past weekend is not something that Bungie's just trying out for these few Crucible Lab weeks this season. This will be the norm next season. And I'm really curious to see overall how the analytics are going to hold up and how the Trials experience is going to be starting at the beginning of a new season when the numbers are very high. Trials is going to be launching week 1 of next season instead of waiting 3 to 4 weeks. So we're going to be able to see right out the gate how these changes feel when player population is at its peak. And if that success rate is still low, even with the changes to the Mercy Passage for giving 2 losses, if If we don't get back up to 25%, guys, to me, that's going to be a concern, because the whole idea of flawless pool is to give everyone a chance to go flawless. And I felt like the good balance here was that it was not something that activated until late into the weekend, hell, Sunday. And outside of folks doing trial carries, all my sweaty players probably already went flawless for that weekend. If that rate, though, continues to decline, and I mean south of 20% consistently, especially next season when these matchmaking changes are live, I think Bungie may need to consider reverting the changes to trials. And again, everyone is getting a different experience. Like if you go look on Twitter, there's a lot of people that said they either love the trial changes this past weekend or absolutely hate it. Let me know in the comments below what you think though, guys. I'm really curious to see everyone's experience this past weekend. Again, the overall goal here is for the trials playlist to be successful. I want this playlist to flourish. And I will say, out of everything that was changed this past weekend, prioritizing connections is always great. The lobby balancing though for solo play is pretty miserable. And I can confidently say, out of everything this past weekend, solo players, you definitely got the short end of the stick. Well, fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching. And as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.